In Isaiah chapter 9, we traced the arc of redemption from the northern darkness of Zebulun and Naphtali to the birth of sovereignty. We saw how light breaks through where darkness was deepest, how joy follows struggle, how the yoke of oppression shatters, how a child is born and the government rests on its shoulders. This is a continuation of that vision. Because Isaiah's prophecy doesn't end with the birth of sovereignty, between the promise and its fulfillment lies a valley of shadow that Isaiah warned about and Moses sang about centuries earlier. The pattern is terrifying in its precision. Civilizations do not collapse by accident. They are dismantled, first from within, then from without. We look at the events of October 7th, the impossible failure of a high-tech military, and we ask how the laws of strategy were suspended. We look at the international courts, where nations guilty of true atrocities sit in judgment of the one democracy fighting for survival, and we ask how the laws of justice were inverted. But these are not random geopolitical anomalies. They are the unfolding of a precise, ancient architecture. Isaiah described the internal rot. Moses described the external judgment. What we are witnessing is not merely war or politics. It is the operational phase of the Song of Ha'azinu. The pattern Isaiah reveals in chapter 9 finds its fullest expression in Moses' final song, the Song of Ha'azinu, in Deuteronomy 32. And what Moses sang millennia ago describes with shocking precision what we witnessed on October 7th, 2023, and in the international response that followed. Moses lays out the progression in 3 devastating verses. First, the attack. Deuteronomy 32, verse 30. How could one chase 1,000 and 2 put 10,000 to flight unless their rock had sold them, unless the Lord had handed them over? This verse poses an impossible question. How does military mathematics collapse so completely? How does the improbable become reality? Consider the mathematical impossibility. 1 chasing 1,000. On that dark Sabbath morning of October 7th, Israel possessed total superiority. Surveillance systems that could detect a bird on the wire, automated machine guns, the most sophisticated intelligence networks in the Western world, fortified communities, armed rapid response units. By every metric of warfare, the breach should have been impossible. And yet, the border dissolved. The intelligence blinded itself. The technology fell silent. Moses had already described this pattern. How could 1 chase 1,000 and 2 put 10,000 to flight? The verse doesn't describe military failure. It describes the suspension of normal ratios. When divine protection is withdrawn, the mathematically impossible becomes reality. And here's what Moses understood. The very impossibility of the event forces a deeper question. Not how did tactics fail, but what has shifted in the foundation. But the humiliation of October 7th was only the first strike. The physical breach was the kinetic opening. The second phase is far more insidious. Second, the inversion. Deuteronomy 32, verse 31. For their rock is not like our rock, even our enemies themselves being judges. Pause here. Because this matters. The verse has 2 parts, and they're saying opposite things simultaneously. Their rock is not like our rock. This is God speaking to Israel. You will prevail. You will win. Because I am fighting for you. The enemies are empty. They're hollow. They collapse under their own weight eventually. My covenant with you is real. Theirs is vapor. But then comes the second half. even our enemies themselves being judges. Wait. What? God just said Israel would win because he's on their side, and immediately after, he says Israel's enemies will become their judges. How does that work? And to be clear from the start, judges here doesn't mean righteous. It means arbiters, those who seize the authority to define the narrative, to determine what counts as lawful and what counts as criminal. Here's what's happening. The enemies don't just attack militarily. They ascend the bench. They don the robes of the magistrate. They seize the authority to define what is law, what is justice, and what is crime. This is a profound inversion of the natural order. In a time of favor, God fights for the nation. But here, the enemies themselves are elevated to the position of judges. But here's the deeper logic. This is a temporary phase of refinement. The enemy becomes a mirror, a distorted mirror, but a mirror nonetheless. The world is judging Israel using a twisted version of Israel's own values: justice, human rights, international law. These concepts originate in the Torah, in the prophetic tradition, in the covenant itself. But now they've been inverted, weaponized, turned back against their source. These aren't just Israel's enemies. In the covenantal framework, they're God's enemies. Nations that have rejected divine justice, that have built entire legal and moral systems on foundations opposed to the covenant. And yet they're now sitting in judgment. This is not a metaphor. At The Hague, the ICC issued arrest warrants. The ICJ ordered provisional measures in a genocide convention case. The UN General Assembly passed resolution after resolution. Consider the scale of the institutional cluster. In 2022 alone, the UN General Assembly passed 15 resolutions against Israel and only 13 against all other countries combined, including Russia, Iran, and North Korea. This isn't oversight. This is obsession. This is the bitterness of the cluster made visible in the voting record. Nations with their own records of atrocities sat in judgment over Israel's conduct in a war Israel didn't start. The verse doesn't say this is just. It says this is what happens. When the enemy occupies the seat of judgment, it reveals something about the spiritual battleground, not about Israel's guilt, but about the enemy's audacity. But how does the vessel crack? What is the internal rot that creates the vacuum for external judgment? That's where Isaiah comes in. We need to understand how these texts speak to each other, how the blueprint Moses laid down becomes the architecture Isaiah builds upon, and how both of them illuminate what's unfolding right now. But first, we need to see where Isaiah himself goes after chapter 9. Because the warning doesn't end with internal collapse. It extends into something even more dangerous, the corruption of justice itself. Before the border is breached, the spirit is breached. Isaiah chapter 10, verse 1. Woe to those who decree iniquitous decrees, and to the writers who write grievousness. The language is surgical. Isaiah isn't describing casual lies or propaganda. He's describing the corruption of the scribe, the lawmaker, the historian, those who possess the authority to record history and define law. In our time, the scribes are the NGOs and UN rapporteurs. They provide the footnotes. They draft the reports. They supply the evidence that the judges then turn into warrants. This is the industrialization of the lie, the mass production of grievance, formatted for legal consumption. Those who decree iniquitous decrees. A decree on earth, in the mystical tradition, reflects a decree in the upper worlds. But Isaiah is describing something twisted, a corruption of justice that begins with the lawmakers themselves. They don't merely speak falsehoods, they legislate them. They write grievousness into the very structure of law. Think about what that means. It's not just that someone lies, it's that the lie becomes official. It gets written down, ratified, entered into the permanent record. The injustice is given the weight of legitimacy. When a society's leadership begins to write grievousness, to codify injustice into the very machinery of the state, they are not merely passing bad laws, they are dismantling the spiritual infrastructure that holds the nation upright. Verse 2. To turn aside the needy from judgment, and to take away the right from the poor of my people, that widows may be their prey, and that they may rob the fatherless. When the judicial structure rots, the vulnerable are consumed first, those without power to defend themselves. Those who need the law to protect them find that the law itself has become predatory. Isaiah is describing the moment when institutions meant to deliver justice become instruments of oppression, when courts meant to protect the weak become weapons against them. And we see this pattern repeat. The ICC and ICJ issued warrants and provisional measures, but they issued nothing for the widows, the orphans, the families of those taken hostage on October 7th. The very courts that claimed to uphold international law turned aside from those who had the clearest claim to justice. The vulnerable were made prey, while the judges pursued other targets. This is the social fracture that precedes the security collapse. When a society stops protecting the widow and the orphan, when the most vulnerable are turned into prey by the very laws meant to shield them, they lose the rock that protects the entire nation. The collapse moves from the social to the security, from the courtroom to the border. Internal moral rot creates the vacuum that external enemies rush to fill. Verse 3. And what will you do in the day of visitation, and in the desolation which shall come from far? To whom will you flee for help? And where will you leave your glory? The prophet is asking 3 questions, and each one cuts deeper. What will you do in the day of visitation? This is the question of the body. When physical danger arrives, your statutes cannot protect your skin. Your legal briefs become irrelevant. The courts that issued warrants, what will they do when the desolation comes for them? But here's the irony. No nation on earth did more to protect enemy civilians than Israel in this war. More than any army in World War II. More than any modern military operating in urban warfare. Roof knocks, warnings, corridors, delays that cost Israeli lives to minimize civilian harm. And the courts condemned Israel anyway. So the question turns back on the judges. If this happened to you, if your civilians were slaughtered, your children taken hostage, your border breached, would you do the same? Would your statutes protect you? Or would you discover that all your legal brilliance cannot stop the dragon when it rises from the sea? To whom will you flee for help? This is the question of alliances. You spent years building a consensus against Israel. You gathered votes, you drafted resolutions, you coordinated campaigns. But in your hour of need, your friends will abandon you. The nations that applauded your verdicts will not answer when you call, because the wine you gave them, the venom of the crooked serpent, will have poisoned them too thoroughly to help you. Where will you leave your glory? This is the question of the soul. Your wisdom, your legal brilliance, your carefully constructed arguments. Where will they rest when the desolation comes from far, when a force arrives that doesn't play by the rules of your crooked system? Your intellect was built on a lie. And when the lie collapses, your glory has nowhere to go. The verse reveals something crucial. These courts think they are visiting judgment upon Israel, but they are the ones being visited. God is entering the courtroom and declaring the proceedings a sham. Power without morality is a house of cards. Verse 3 is the moment the wind blows. The corrupt scribe, the one who writes the warrants, is the most vulnerable of all, because he has no rock to stand on when the glory departs. Verse 4. There is nothing except to kneel beneath captivity, and beneath the slain they shall fall. For all this his anger has not turned back, and his hand is still stretched out. This is a prophecy about a future event, and it's not complicated. There is nothing except to kneel beneath captivity. The Hebrew word here is bilti, without me. This is the removal of the divine restraining force. When God withdraws from the structure, chaos is no longer held back. The judges, the leaders who sit in their courts and issue their verdicts, will have no escape. They will be forced to kneel. Not by Israel, by captors within their own nations. This is the measure for measure reversal. The nations held Israel captive to their accusations. They put Israel on trial. They issued arrest warrants. They claimed the authority to judge. But the verse says their time is coming. They will kneel beneath captivity. Think about what's already happening in Western nations. Leaders who spend their energy condemning Israel, while forces of chaos grow within their own borders. Radicalism they won't name. Violence they won't confront. Hostages taken on their own streets. A society that weaponizes its courts eventually loses its protection. When the restraining force is removed, captivity follows, not as metaphor, but as consequence. The prophecy is simple. If you use your courts to attack the nation fighting for civilization, you will lose the protection that keeps your own society stable. And when that protection is gone, you won't be the judge anymore. You'll be the captive. And beneath the slain, they shall fall. If not captivity, then worse. The second option is death. 2 outcomes, no third option. For all this, his anger has not turned back. The anger, the corrective force, is still active. The process isn't finished. God's response to the corruption of justice is ongoing. The reckoning continues. And his hand is still stretched out. This is the crucial phrase. The hand doesn't pull back. Divine action continues. The intervention hasn't withdrawn. What does that mean, practically? It means the collapse isn't a single event. It's a chain reaction. First, the courts lose their authority. Then, social order begins to crack. Then, physical security fails. Then, captivity or death. And the hand stays stretched out through all of it, not to comfort, but to correct. Not to rescue those who rejected the rock, but to demonstrate what happens when protection is removed. This is the arc of the story. The judges who condemned Israel will become the judged. The courts that issued warrants will face forces they cannot control. The leaders who attacked the only nation defending civilization will kneel beneath captivity in their own lands. The prophecy is waiting to be fulfilled, and the hand is still stretched out. But who are these judges? What is the source of their moral authority? The text doesn't stop there. It continues. Deuteronomy 32, verse 32. Their vine grows from the vine of Sodom, from the fields of Gomorrah. Their grapes are poisonous, Their clusters are bitter. Their mask is stripped away. Now Moses is describing the judges themselves, the ones passing sentence. And what he reveals is that their entire system, their legal framework, their moral reasoning, their accusations, is rooted in the vine of Sodom. Sodom wasn't destroyed for sexual immorality alone. Sodom was destroyed because it codified cruelty into law. It made oppression legal. It turned injustice into public policy. The city wrote its violence into its statutes, recorded it, made it official. And that's what their vine means. It's not just corruption. It's corruption that has been formalized, institutionalized, made respectable. Evil that wears the garments of legitimacy. Leaders use legal language to commit crimes. They record injustice. They build cases. They write briefs. They convene panels. And all of it carries the appearance of law, but it grows from the vine of Sodom. Look at what's happening right now. Have you seen commentators discuss actual genocide? When the conversation turns to real atrocities, mass graves, systematic rape camps, ethnic cleansing campaigns still unfolding, there is a natural human reaction to genuine horror. The tone is somber, the faces are grave, the language is careful, because real suffering demands respect, even in condemnation. But observe the vine of Sodom in the modern media. When false allegations are leveled against Israel, when the grapes of gall are crushed into the wine of propaganda, the countenance of the accuser changes. Watch their faces. They smile. TV commentators and pundits often mutter these allegations with a faint, imperceptible smile. It is the smile of the vine, a toxic delight in the spreading of the lie. There's a lightness, a satisfaction, an almost gleeful certainty. Meanwhile, in Israel after October 7th, 64% of the population reported a significant decline in their sense of personal security. Shattered families, hostages still in captivity, communities still displaced, real trauma, real grief. And the commentators smile. This is the contrast that exposes the cruelty of the vine. The Sodomite root is not rooted in a desire for justice, but in a perverse joy found in the destruction of the reputation of the divine's representatives. This is the vine of Sodom. It's not just the lie, it's the pleasure taken in the lie, the smile while delivering the accusation, the comfort in the cruelty. And here's the deeper mechanism. The wine is not just a lie, it's an addiction. The nations drink it because it makes them feel morally superior. It allows them to stand in judgment without examining their own crimes. It permits the authoritarian to lecture the democracy. It enables the colonizer to condemn the indigenous return. The wine intoxicates because it inverts reality so completely that the drinker experiences moral elevation while descending into delusion. This is why they smile. The wine works. The lie provides what truth cannot, the sensation of righteousness without the burden of repentance. And Moses adds another detail. Their clusters are bitter. Clusters. Not a single grape. Clusters. The cluster reveals the structure of the lie. A cluster is many individual grapes held together by a single stem. This represents the false unity of the nations when they gather against Israel. A single lie is easy to debunk, but a cluster of lies, where the media, the courts, and the politicians all support each other's falsehoods, creates a bitter reality that is hard to break. The clusters also represent the enemies themselves, the judges and leaders who sit in groups, like a bench of judges. Their bitterness comes from the fact that they reinforce each other's bias, ensuring that the wine they produce, the verdict, is pure poison. One lie leads to the next. Israel is an occupier clusters with Israel commits genocide. They are interconnected, so that if you pull on one accusation, the whole bitter bunch comes with it. This cluster logic chokes the truth, making it impossible for the world to see the rock. If you see one, there are many around it. The lie is never isolated. The false accusation is always part of a larger system. One smiling commentator represents an entire editorial board. One biased UN resolution represents an entire institution. One ICC warrant represents a coordinated legal strategy. The clusters reveal that this isn't random. It's cultivated, organized, systemic. And the mystical tradition adds another layer here. Isaiah 27:1-2 will later describe the choking vine, the parasitic force that wraps around truth and suffocates it. This vine thrives on the chaotic mixture of good and evil. It masquerades as moral outrage while feeding on something darker. Where you see one smiling accuser, there is a cluster, a legion, waiting behind them. It is a systemic, spiritual infection dressed in the language of justice. Deuteronomy 32, verse 33. Their wine is the venom of serpents, the cruel poison of asps. It gets worse. Now the image shifts from plant to poison. The wine pressed from the grapes of Sodom isn't just bitter, it's lethal, it's venom. And not just any venom, serpent venom. Serpents don't announce themselves. They strike from hiding. Their venom works slowly, spreading through the bloodstream, paralyzing before killing. This is the nature of the accusations. They're not frontal assaults. They're coiled, patient, delivered with the appearance of reason. Legal briefs, scholarly papers, international resolutions, all of it wrapped in the language of justice, human rights, international law. But underneath, it's venom. It's designed to paralyze Israel's ability to defend itself, to isolate the nation diplomatically, to make self-defense itself appear criminal. This narrative is not water. It is venom. It paralyzes. It is designed to numb the moral reflexes of the West, to make the defense of civilization seem criminal, and to make barbarism seem like resistance. It is a sophisticated, intoxicating poison that the nations drink until they are drunk with hatred. And here's the specific danger. This wine, this poisoned narrative, gets passed around. Nations drink it. Institutions adopt it. Media outlets distribute it. Universities teach it. And the more it circulates, the more it appears legitimate. The serpent doesn't need to bite everyone. It just needs to inject enough venom into the system that the body stops functioning. It appears they have the upper hand. The media smiles. The courts rule. The vine spreads. It looks like the serpent has struck and the venom is spreading. It looks like the vine of Sodom is flourishing. It looks like the enemies who sit as judges have the upper hand. But they have forgotten something. Deuteronomy 32, verse 34. Is not this laid up in store with me, sealed up in my treasuries? God is keeping a ledger. Every lie, every false accusation, every smiling commentator, every biased resolution, every nation that condemned Israel while committing actual atrocities, every judge who twisted law into a weapon, every inversion of justice where the victim is blamed for the crime. None of it is forgotten. None of it is overlooked. It's all being recorded, sealed, stored. Not reactively, not emotionally, with precision, The enemies think they're writing history. They think their verdicts will stand. They think the narrative they're constructing will become the permanent record. But God is writing a different ledger. The verse doesn't say when. It just says, it's sealed, stored, waiting. Deuteronomy 32, verse 35. Vengeance is mine and recompense. Their foot shall slip in due time. For the day of their calamity is at hand, and the things that shall come upon them make haste. Now comes the response. Vengeance is mine. Not Israel's. Israel doesn't need to settle the score. Israel doesn't need to make the enemies pay. God handles that himself. The nation's job is to hold fast, to survive, to maintain internal coherence, to not collapse under the pressure. But the vengeance is guaranteed. Their foot shall slip in due time. This is the turning point. The enemies appear stable. They appear to have the upper hand. They control the courts. They write the resolutions. They issue the warrants. They craft the narratives. Their systems look permanent. Their institutions seem unshakable, but their footing is unstable. And when the moment arrives, in due time, the collapse is sudden. The day of their calamity is at hand. Not distant, not theoretical, at hand, approaching. And when it comes quickly. The things that shall come upon them make haste. History is filled with examples. Assyria, Babylon, Rome, the Third Reich, the Soviet Union, empires that looked permanent, systems that seemed unshakable. And then, suddenly, the foot slips, the foundations crack, and the collapse is total. Moses is telling Israel, the enemies will judge you. They will sit in their courts and issue their verdicts. They will smile while they lie. Their vine will spread. Their venom will circulate. And it will look, for a time, like they have the upper hand. But their foot is already slipping. They just don't know it yet. And God has already opened the treasury. He's already measuring the recompense. The day of their calamity is already approaching. Israel's task is not to bring that day. It's to survive until it arrives. But there's more. Because this entire pattern, the vine of Sodom, the venom of serpents, the slipping foot, appears again in Isaiah. And when Isaiah picks up this thread, he reveals exactly how the serpents are defeated. Isaiah chapter 27, verse 1. In that day the Lord will punish with his harsh, mighty, and powerful sword Leviathan, the fleeing serpent, Leviathan, the coiling serpent, and he will kill the dragon in the sea. 3 enemies, 3 names, 1 sword, Leviathan the fleeing serpent. This is the intellectual attack, the legal brief, the precise, calculated accusation delivered with the appearance of logic and reason. It flees because it cannot stand direct confrontation. It operates in the shadows of bureaucracy, in the fine print of resolutions, in the procedural manipulation of courts. It looks legitimate. It sounds authoritative, but underneath, it's a serpent. Leviathan the coiling serpent. This is the moral attack, the twisting of justice itself, the accusations that flip victim and aggressor, that redefine genocide to apply to the nation defending itself while ignoring actual extermination campaigns. It coils because it wraps around truth and strangles it. It's crooked because it bends reality into its opposite. The dragon in the sea. This is the collective power of nations, the institutions, the empires, the assembled might of those who gather against Israel, coordinating their assaults, pooling their venom. The dragon rises from chaos, from the depths where order has broken down. All three will be slain, not by Israel, by God, with one sword. And that sword, according to the text, is forged from the contents of the sealed treasury, every lie that was recorded, every false accusation that was stored up, every twisted verdict that was sealed away. All of it becomes the material from which the sword is made. God doesn't bring an outside punishment. He turns the enemy's own written records into the instrument of their execution. The statutes they wrote to trap Israel, the legal briefs, the UN resolutions, the court decisions, the iniquitous decrees of Isaiah 10, become the coils that strangle them. The very weapons the enemies used, their legal language, their moral accusations, their coordinated institutions, will be turned back on them. The venom they injected into the system will be extracted and concentrated into the blade that destroys them. But there's a final verse, and it shows what happens after the serpents are slain. Isaiah 27, verse 2. In that day, a vineyard of foaming wine. Sing to it. After the serpents are destroyed, after the vine of Sodom is uprooted, a different vineyard appears. A vineyard of foaming wine. This connects directly to Isaiah 10:4 and Deuteronomy 32:35. The day of visitation that was promised, the desolation that comes from far, will arrive in the nations of the judges themselves. God steps in, and he allows an October 7th-like black swan event to happen, not to Israel this time, but to the nations that accused Israel. The terror that visited Israel will visit the lands of those who issued the warrants. The captivity that Isaiah prophesied, to kneel beneath captivity, will manifest in the cities of the West. The forces of chaos the judges refused to name, the radicalism they accommodated, the violence they enabled, all of it will turn inward. And it is through this, through the collapse of their own security, through the breach of their own borders, through the terror on their own streets, that the Leviathan is slain. The fleeing serpent that hid in bureaucracy will be exposed when the bureaucracy fails. The coiling serpent that twisted justice will be strangled by its own contradictions when their legal systems cannot protect them. The dragon in the sea, the collective power of nations, will be dragged out and killed when the chaos they enabled rises up within their own borders. The sword is forged from their own records, but it strikes through the very terror they dismissed. And when that day comes, when the judges kneel beneath their own captives, when their legal systems collapse under the weight of their moral cowardice, when the desolation arrives on their own streets, the nations will be forced to drink a different wine. A system trained on poison cannot digest truth. When reality returns, the reflex is choking, not because the wine is toxic, but because the palate was trained on venom. The lie that was meant to destroy Israel eventually destroys the liar. The very courts that issued arrest warrants will be exposed. The very institutions that passed resolutions will collapse. The very commentators who smiled through accusations will be confronted with what they enabled. And the vineyard of Israel, the true system of justice, the real moral framework, will stand. Not because Israel is perfect, not because the nation has no failings, but because the covenant is real, because the rock of Israel is not like their rock, because what God has planted cannot be uprooted by serpents, no matter how many of them coil together. This is the pattern Moses laid down and Isaiah built upon. October 7th was the physical breach, the dragon rising from the sea. The Hague is the fleeing serpent, the legal attack hiding in bureaucracy, two heads of the same Leviathan attacking in sequence. We are living in the middle of this pattern right now. October 7th was the impossible defeat, the Deuteronomy 32, verse 30, moment when one chased 1,000, the International Criminal Court, the UN resolutions, the smiling commentators. These are the verse 31 judges. The systematic bias, the coordinated campaigns, the legal venom. This is the vine of Sodom in verses 32 and 33. But Deuteronomy 32, verse 34, is already active. The treasury is being filled. Every false accusation is being recorded. Every twisted verdict is being sealed away. And Deuteronomy 32, verse 35 is approaching. The foot is beginning to slip. The calamity is making haste. The sword is being prepared. God steps in not when the nation is strong, but when its power is gone, to demonstrate that survival is not a product of politics, but of covenant. Israel's task is not to bring the judgment. Israel's task is to hold fast, to maintain internal unity, to refuse the venom even when it's offered in the language of international law, to not collapse under pressure, to survive until the serpent's foot slips and the day of their calamity arrives. Because it will arrive. Moses promised it. Isaiah confirmed it. And the zeal of the Lord of hosts will accomplish it. The judges still sit. The venom still circulates. But the ledger is sealed, and the rock is not like their rock. The pattern is not complete, but it is unfolding. Walk in it.